Welcome to the Survivor's Guide to Thriving podcast, the show for people who are ready to break out of survival mode in order to build a truly thriving life. I'm Amanda Solman, and along with Mark Jewell, my co-host and the founder and CEO of Mark Jewell Speaking and Training, we break down common roadblocks that keep people stuck surviving and share ideas to help you thrive each and every day. This week, Mark and I are talking about radical self-accountability and how taking responsibility for where you are and where you want to be can be a total game changer. We dig into the stories that run our lives and how to make change when we don't like that story. This is one of the foundational concepts we teach all of our clients, and it can apply in a whole host of situations. Enjoy the show. Mark, to get us started, radical self-accountability. Sounds super fancy. Tell me, what in the heck is that, and where does this idea come from?
Very good question. So that is what I wanted to dive into today because it's something that I am seeing come up quite a bit. Certainly in my own life, I'm seeing it come up with our coaching clients here at MJST. And this is, effectively dialing back into the idea that we've got to get away from the blame game. We've got to dive out of this roller coaster of, blaming people when things are going downhill, just like if you're riding next to your roller coaster, next to your friend who talked you into going on the roller coaster. And it seemed like a good idea until you crest that first major drop. And then you're sitting here thinking, oh shit. And then you look at the other person, I can't believe you talked me into this. Right. But nobody held a gun to your head to make you get on the stupid thing in the first place. It fully comes back to you. And so here's what's really important, right? So not only getting away from blaming people for our negative situations, right? But if we're not fully owning, radically owning our own responsibility and owning our own accountability, what that means is that when you win, when things go well, that means that you're also not fully responsible for that. And so what I like to say, and this is just how, what I've created for a standard in my life, is I'm not willing to let anybody else be in control of how I feel or get the results that I'm creating, that I want. Anytime that I put that, give that ownership or put that accountability over on somebody else, what that means is that I'm no longer in control. I'm not driving. And so that's one of the things that I really wanted to dive into today with this podcast is to help people start telling the story or continue telling the story and maybe even enhance the story to help them have more of what they want to be living in. So that's the direction I wanted to tee us up with here today, Amanda, because I just see too many people living the blame game. It's all over the news. It's rampant in society. It's 90% of the population blaming everybody else for something else, and it's just a bunch of crap. We got to move on before we can move on.
Yeah. Well, and the other thing I just want to layer in is because of those things you just said, right, that it's so rampant among all of us, is that it's really hard to catch ourselves sometimes because we don't even recognize we're doing it. I think of how often we say things like, oh my gosh, that person just made me so angry, or, oh man, they just, whatever, they made me fill in the blank.
Right.
And it's not out of I'm specifically going to blame someone else, but it's just so natural to say however I feel is because someone else did something versus saying, yeah, they did this thing, whatever this thing is, but I made a conscious choice as to how to react to it. So I just want to recognize that it is challenging to kind of change that behavior because it just comes so naturally to just let it roll off the tongue that way.
Yes. And I'll caveat this. This will easily be one of the most challenging concepts that we probably have ever taught in the 62, 3, 4 episodes that we've recorded now. I don't even know where we're at. But between the stuff that, the interviews that you've done with Wade and John and Christina from our team and the other interviews that we brought in with outside resources, this concept here today, fully owning your shit is going to be easily one of the most challenging that you'll get into, because what this really means is that whatever happens to you today and going forward is completely on you. Like, that's on you, not your CEO who said this and that made you feel X, not your wife or your husband who did this and that made you happy, angry, sad, lonely, scared, whatever, like all the feelings, all the emotions, right? Like, you get to own 100% for how you're feeling, how you're acting, how you're showing up, where you're showing up, what kind of results you're producing, your relationship with your spouse, your relationship with your coworkers, your relationship everywhere in life. So this is like literally owning that, and then starting with that as a platform, being able to build the story that you want to be living.
Yeah. And so, Mark, I know that for you, this concept has really grown out of something Jack Canfield wrote about in his book, Success Principles. So tell me a little bit more about kind of where that started and how it continues to evolve for you, for your clients. I'm just kind of curious on that background.
Yeah, absolutely. So, years ago when I was going through a tough time, this is going back 6 or 7 years ago when I just was, just turned 30 or was about to turn 30. And quite frankly, like, I wasn't happy with the story that I was living. And, so some of you that are whatever watching this on Facebook, maybe hearing some of this for the first time, some of you that are listening to the podcast, may not know all of the backstory. But, frankly, when I'm going to have my 37th birthday here in a couple of weeks. And so it was about this time, call it 7 years ago, when I was just pretty disappointed with the overall picture of how things were showing up, financially, in my physical, being, fitness wise, in my business. Like, I didn't have the level of significance that I felt I should have in my career. I didn't have the money I felt I should have in my career. The story that way was not super positive. At least I wasn't, living in something that I wanted to be living in at that point. Relationship was tough at home. It was all the things, right? It just felt like I had been, I got out of college and went into my career, and then I spent 7 years kind of getting beat up. That's kind of how I felt. Now, there's not that all of it was bad, and it's not that all, it wasn't all. We had a lot of great things, got married, had kids, did a lot of cool stuff in that 7 year time frame. However, I just wasn't happy. I wasn't happy with the story that I was showing up with. And so one night I'm sitting in a hotel, and I had literally taken a book that my wife had at home at the time that Vanessa had here called Success Principles by Jack Canfield. So for those of you that don't know Jack Canfield, he and Mark Victor Hansen wrote the Chicken Soup for the Soul series. I always say next to the Bible, Harry Potter and 50 Shades of Grey is the most successful book of all time, right? It's like fourth place now. So, but these guys know a thing or two about being successful, because, when Mark Victor Hansen and Jack Canfield were trying to get their book sold, they were trying to sell this idea. They literally got rejected by like 145 authors. I mean, if you know the book series, like, how successful it is. There's dozens and dozens of different versions, all printed in hundreds of languages. I mean, they're all over the place. And so what happened is, they had this great level of success. And then years later, Jack Canfield wrote the book called Success Principles. There's 36 principles. And so, back to the story, I'd taken this book, that my wife had at the house. And I was at the hotel one night when I was on a trip for work, and I started reading it. And in the very first principle of the book, I mean, literally not even 30 pages into this thing, he gets into all the principles. Principle number 1 is that you're 100% responsible for everything that happens to you. You're 100% responsible for everything that happens to you. And I'm like, bullshit. Right? Like, I don't make, that person treat me that way. Like, I don't tell my kids to give me, a hard time or to do the opposite of what I say. Like, I don't, tell my wife to get triggered when I don't get the lawn mowed on time or don't take the trash out or whatever. Those are the proverbial things that, create conflict, or when the money gets tight or whatever, I don't make that stuff happen. And so as you read through the book, though, suddenly you start to realize, oh, yes, you do. If the relationship isn't where you want it, and you just want this person to go away, who's responsible for you still being there, or how you're feeling in that moment, what happens for me, when I go back and I read the book, even still, I get in this conversation with Jack Canfield, even though I've never met him, right? Never been in one of his trainings, never done, but I get in this conversation. I'm like, Jack, am I really, accountable for, what's going on here? And, the basic premise is like, I mean, I can't necessarily control the fact that we had a thunderstorm this morning, as I'm going to the gym. I can't control like necessarily how my wife feels when she wakes up in the morning, or what her attitude is going to be like, or how my kids are going to react all the time. I do get control over how I react to it, what my mindset is, how I take that all in, right? And so if your thoughts, right, and they're your thoughts, they're not somebody else's thoughts. Like literally nobody else can put a thought into your brain. Somebody can make a suggestion, somebody can do something, they can say something, but the thoughts that happen as a result of that trigger are 100% yours. And so, as I'm reading through Jack's book and I'm thinking, Jack, am I really responsible for all like my financial picture? Like sometimes the deals just don't go through, right? And, I don't control the economy, but he's like, I mean, you're the player, you're choosing to do what you do. You choose on how many, at the time I was in a sales job, you choose how many prospect calls you make on a daily basis. You choose how relentlessly you follow up. You choose all these things. Shit, it literally like put me in a situation. I was like, wow, like I really am in control of all these things. And so that was the beginning. And I'm not going to claim any level of perfection on what we're talking about here today. Like, guys, like this is a constant growth for me, for everybody on our team, for everybody that's involved with us. I mean, this is a thing where it's, it's just a matter of choosing the mindset of I'm not going to allow anybody else to be the dictator or to be the dictator of like how I'm going to feel or how I'm going to be acting or how I'm going to be reacting throughout the course of the day. What it basically says is this is your life. These are your relationships. This is your body. This is your nutrition. This is your business results. This is your spirituality. Whatever results you have there are yours. You have created those results. And any time that you spend blaming somebody else for your results is simply an indicator that you actually care more about what somebody else thinks than what you think. You care more about what somebody else has done than what you have done. And it actually it causes you to leak energy. Like literally it drains you of energy to be focusing on blaming. And so that book for me was the catalyst to recognize the concept. And then once I understood, like I'm 100% responsible for all the things that I'm experiencing, how I'm experiencing them, how I'm showing up, the results I'm creating. For me, that was the moment where everything really started to shift because it put me back in the driver's seat. And even though I've had plenty of days where I was like mad or I was blaming somebody for how I felt or, ticked off at my wife or got upset with my kids, whatever. The other day I lost my shit on a scooter because I stuck my toe on it in the kitchen where it's not supposed to be. I mean, even though these things like will happen, what I know is like, I don't allow anybody else to be in control of the direction that I'm heading. And when I pull on this radical self-accountability, everything shifted. Everything, everything in the business, the people, the customers, all the cool things that we've been able to attract, everything shifted.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Now, so you talked about, your thoughts, your reactions, and all of those are just simply a part of, the story that is driving your life, right? And there's probably multiple stories at play there. And one thing we always talk about, and as part of this idea of taking 100% responsibility, self accountability, is that if you don't like the story that you're living in, you get to change it. Right.
Right.
And so talk to me a little bit more. We talked about thoughts, we talked about reactions, but break down for me what all goes into creating that story that's really driving a lot of your behaviors now as an
Right.
adult.
Yeah. So we got to go back in time just a little bit to before any of us was like, say, 9 years old. So in the beginning of your life, there's a lot going on. There's tons of cognitive development happening, physical development, all the things. And so as a part of that, your brain is literally kind of wiring itself together and developing preferences even before you're born. And so during that time frame, what we now know is like roughly 95% of your neural pathways that will sort of drive your preferences, the neurological hardwiring, if you will. We know that about 95% of that is basically baked in by the time you're 9 years old or so. And some people will even go so far as to say 7. I'm seeing some new stuff now. I just don't have the research to back it up. And so that's interesting, right? Because if you look at the core of that, like we're literally making decisions as children based on the experiences, based on the energies, based on what's going on in your environment about that are going to impact you for the rest of your life. And so it's like I'm going to build the ship that I'm going to drive for the rest of my life before I know what a ship is, right? Before I really even know what that looks like. And so that's just a really important piece to get. So that piece is important. So now to build on that, think about when something happens. Like I always use the example when we teach this in the classroom, use the example of road rage, right? So somebody cuts you off. Now, nobody blames you if you get like super pissed about somebody who cut you off, ran a red light, or did something to make you feel unsafe. That's basic sort of like survival mechanisms in the brain. Nobody really gets upset about that. Yet, what we also know is like, my experience and like, if somebody cuts me off or goes in front of me, like I may very well like tailgate them just to make a point. Like, let's make all of us more unsafe in order to make the point that you shouldn't have done that, right? Yet your experience, man, that could be completely different. Like, wow, that person's really like, they must be in a hurry. I'm going to make sure that they, I get out of their way so that they can get on to wherever they're going. So we all have a very, very different experience, based on whatever the trigger or whatever the stimulus is, because the creation of your 95% was very different than mine was. Where you grew up, when you grew up, the environmental factors, the parental factors, the grandparents, the things that happened to you at school as a kid, that was different for all of us. Like we all had that really unique scenario. So when something happens, let's say a trigger as an example. What I mean by a trigger could be a happy trigger, something that happens that gives you joy or makes you giggle, chuckle, laugh, whatever. And then something that gives you like maybe anger, rage, mad, sad, that's bad, that shouldn't happen that way, whatever. That there are triggers that create that too. So that's what I'm talking about. What is the event, the thing that happened, the thing that you experienced? And so very, very quickly, because of this whole 95%, here's what goes down. You have a thought, and that thought is basically baked in. Like you have a thought that something should be this way or something shouldn't be that way. And so if you think about like when you're driving and you're going down the interstate at 80 miles an hour, and all of a sudden, somebody swerves over towards your lane because they got hit by a gust of wind, like you can go instantly pissed. Right? You could be like driving along, listening to the Survivor's Guide to Thriving podcast, having a great day, right? And then all of a sudden, like, boom, like you can go from 0 to pissed in a very, very short amount of time. Why? Because that thought is that fast. It's incredibly quick. So what happens is that thought actually creates a feeling in the body. When you're experiencing joy or elation or sadness or rage, those are feelings. You actually experience those in your body. Like sometimes like your jaw gets tense, your shoulders will be up, you start to get tense in your back, all the things, right? And then like you literally feel the sense, like the anxiety in the body as an example. Or you can feel like when it's something happy, if it's a happy trigger, right, it's light and airy and it just feels like it's fun, you're giggling and you're relaxed. So there's all these different little neurochemicals in the body, biochemicals in the body that are helping you feel this. And so that trigger produced a thought. That thought caused your brain to kind of produce a feeling all throughout your body, which it then interprets back as feedback. And then we make a decision on what we should do about it. So this is the moment where you decide, I'm going to tailgate that person because they just cut me off. They swerved over in front of me. Or I'm going to speed past them and give them a finger because that's always the best solution. Right? Or whatever it is. Or you can, I'm not going to go into all the different types of triggers and all the different things that can happen, but you have that response, right? So a lot of times what we think about is like, when somebody did this, then I did that. Right? But there's these 2 steps that have to happen in between, which is there's a thought, and it's faster than the speed of light, I think. And I don't have the proof on that. I just know it's incredibly quick. And then that feeling is quick to follow. And those are just literally kind of hardwired in the body. If you got mad because somebody cut you off, nobody like blames you. If you got sad because you got fired, nobody's going to blame you. If relationship is on the rocks and you're complaining about it, like most of the time, nobody will call you out based on what's going on, right? Because it's just, people are kind of normal. It's maybe similar experiences, but not always. So here's what starts to happen over time. We have our triggers, we have our thoughts, we have our feelings, and then we take an action. That action will always produce a result. The result is going to be whatever, whatever the outcome is based on the experience. It could be a null result. It could be a positive result. It could be a negative result, whatever that is. And then that result serves as another trigger, which you have another thought and feeling. And so this is where winning streaks come from. So when you're winning, you're like, you literally can't screw up. This is what's happening. And then when you're on a losing streak and it's like, man, it's like, could anybody be screwing this up any worse than I am right now? We be honest, like you've all had that thought, right? We all have had that thought at some point in life, like nobody could be screwing this up as badly as I am. Yet, if you look to your left or look to your right, guarantee you'll find somebody whose situation is way worse than yours. But we have these things that we do. And so, just to kind of go back to it, I mean, the trigger produces a thought produces a feeling is going to produce an action. Your action is going to net you a result, and that will, in effect, be another trigger. And this is how we go throughout our day. And we're literally doing this all the time to all the stimulus, to all the things that are going on all around us. You may be doing this millions of times a day, and it's as natural as a tick on a dog, to use an overused analogy, but that is just totally normal, right? We don't even think about it. That's how it's just baked into our DNA. So here's what happens. Let's just say, as an example, I've got a relationship situation going on, and it could be your home relationship, it could be a work relationship. Maybe it's a peer in the cubicle next to you, and they're like a loud chewer. Maybe it's like, something that your CEO does and you feel like they're hiding information from you, or you never get the full story. Literally just had a conversation with somebody on the phone right before we recorded this podcast where, they literally got lied to about their CEO they were told he left on his own volition, only to find out that he was forced out. And so, what does that do for the trust? What's the story for the employees about the new person who suddenly is in that old person's role, and that old person was very well liked, right? So now all of a sudden, based on that trigger, we have some thoughts and some feelings, right? And that causes us to maybe take action, or in many cases, this is where disengagement comes from in the workplace, is we don't take action, or we procrastinate on action, or we half-ass the action, or whatever. And so then we start to create a story around that. And so this is effectively what we in our world call the story framework. This is how we create our stories. And so when she does this and you think she shouldn't, right, you have a story about that. When he does that and you think he should or shouldn't, you have a story about that. And what's kind of funny about these stories, right, is like, and because of the way our human brain works, what's funny about these things is we start to get into like, if my story about you is positive, I'm more likely to look for the things that I like about you and highlight those. Right. And so, and then if I get into a story about what I don't like about you, then I start to look for those. By the way, it works on you, right? So each of us has a story about ourselves. And this is a thing that we may commonly refer to as self-esteem, right? But when we have a positive outlook about our current story, you'll start to look for the things that support a positive story. When you start to get down on yourself, you're down on your luck, a couple things didn't go right, whatever, the common thing around here is like, we're training a puppy, and so the dog craps on the floor. Like if you walk out of your bedroom in the morning and you step in a pile of poop, like that could trigger like a whole negative series of things throughout the day. Why? Because we start to look for things going wrong, right? We start to look for evidence that supports the story that says that things aren't going to go right. So let me tie this back to radical self-accountability. If you don't like the story that you're living in, then it's time to start going to work on changing the story. We can talk about the how-to in a minute, but I want to like drive this point home. If you don't like the story that you're living in life right now, if you don't like the story about your relationship at home right now, if you don't like the body that you have right now, if you don't like your energy level or your nutrition, or if you don't like the way things are going on at your company right now, then it's time to start telling a different story. And anchor that in hard, because guys, you're the only one who gets to determine what your story turns out to be. At the end of the day, you can blame all you want, and then your story will be one of how you blamed your life away and put that in control of everybody else. But if you want to have the epic love story, the epic hero's journey, the epic, movie that is you as the central character of your personal movie, then you get to start telling the story that you want to live.
And in that, I think part of it to remember is that changing the story to me can come in two different ways. Like, one, you can literally just change how you look at the exact same situation, right? So, like, nothing about the situation necessarily has to change. You can just change how you see it. So, maybe you look for different things in the situation, or you try to understand why people are doing the way they're doing what they're doing, in which case you see the situation differently. Or you can literally, which we're going to flesh out here in a minute, a little more in a minute, change the actions to actually change the course of events that are happening to reinforce or create this story in the first place. So, really important stuff there that all begins with you and with a choice that you have to make.
Absolutely.
So,
Absolutely. Mhm.
Uh, I thought it was really funny. So this morning I was listening to a new audio book called Kick Ass, which is by Mel Robbins, who did the 5 Second Rule book. And she actually talked about a very similar cycle. It was much more simplified, like triggers and behaviors in a cycle. But it's just so funny how some of these concepts show up. What we call the story, she calls patterns. Like it was just kind of interesting to see the overlapping recognition. But I do want to dig in a little bit more. So you said, right, like if you don't like your story, then you get to change your story, either how you look at it or literally the series of actions, triggers, reactions that are occurring within that cycle that we talked about. So
Right.
from your perspective, if someone says, I don't like what's going on in my marriage, or I don't like what's going on in my job, or I don't like what's going on in my body, or whatever, where do
Mhm.
they start to make some progress?
So let's go back to the framework, right? So everything that we do always revolves around different frames or frameworks that allow us to identify where we're at. So let's just say I don't like the story in whichever area of life you don't like your story. Well, we've all probably got one. I know I've got a couple. So there's two places that are ideal to disrupt the cycle. One of them is immediate, and we'll give you a short-term fix. And then one of them has what I call a slow burn, right? It's got a longer-term effect. And so the number one place is to just go to that cycle, the trigger, the thought, the feeling, the action, the result, the trigger, the thought, the feeling, the action, result. Go and look at what action could I immediately take in order to start getting a better result. I'll just take whatever. A lot of the stuff that, even like when it comes to getting results in the corporate space, a lot of the times when I'm working with guys, it has more to do with the relationship at home not being on point. That's causing a lot of the struggle. So if I can deal with the stuff that's going on at home, magically, a lot of times the stress comes off at work and I start producing more. Just kind of an interesting observation over time. But so let's just say I don't like where that relationship is today. And I might ask one of our coaching clients, like, okay, well, when's the last time you took your wife on a date? And then there's the long awkward pause after I ask the question, and it's because a lot of times, I mean, with some of the, if somebody comes to our program who's been married for 30 years, it might've been 20 since they really went on, hired the babysitter, like bought flowers, planned the dinner, like made it happen. Right. It's a common goal that people have coming out of our programs, with our 12-week coaching program. A lot of times they're like, I'm going to do 6 date nights in the next 12 weeks. I need to start dating my wife again. And some of them are concerned. They're literally concerned because here's what happens. They start to get worried about, if I ask my wife out on a date, she's going to wonder what I'm up to. She's going to wonder what I did wrong. Right. But that's part of the story. And this is one of the reasons that people don't take action. But number one thing is just plan a date. Literally, it's that simple. Tell her, hey, on Thursday night, I've got a reservation for us at 7:00. Here's what you need to wear. Take control of that situation, take a different action next time. Maybe you guys can plan something together. You can have fun with it. It can evolve. But that's just one of those different actions, like literally just doing one thing differently, right? And then you get to continue looking at the cycle and say, okay, did that give me the results that I wanted? Do we feel more connected as a result of going on the date? If you get the result and it's a yes, the big old thumbs up, then it's like, okay, cool. Now we repeat the behavior. So in another week or 2 weeks, we plan on another one. Let's take a work example. For example, let's say you've got a member of your team, you're a manager, you're in that leadership role, and one of your team members is just consistently showing up late. Okay, hourly employee, somewhat disengaged, something's going on. So I look at it from this way, like so we have two options. I can get into the story about why that person is lazy and they think they're entitled, and they can come in at 8:15 instead of 8:00. Right. So that's option one. Option two is to start wondering and to take responsibility of this. So how could I create a work environment where it's exciting as hell to show up at 8:00 because that's something that we do. Right. And so, what I do is I plan a team huddle or something at 8:00 tomorrow at 8:05. And, whatever, I'm going to unveil, kind of a new policy, new something that we're going over, like, try to sell it as something that's more exciting than policy. But, we put together something that we get to do as a team tomorrow morning at 8:00. And all of a sudden, if I can win in that 8:00 timeframe and help that person have a positive experience and help them feel like they belong, maybe actually recognize them in front of the group for something that they did well, even though they showed up late, and that's what's triggering you. Now, all of a sudden, I'm having a positive experience, and subconsciously, maybe I start to make a better decision about what time I show up. Obviously, we can just have a conversation and say, hey, is there a reason that we can't, get here by 8:00 because that's the start time? Let's get to the bottom of that. Like, let's be supportive rather than just making the assumption that they should have it all figured out. What you don't know is that they've got a sick kid at home and they've got to take some stuff, or their spouse just left and now they got to do all the drop-offs in the morning, and they just literally can't get it done before 8:15. Right? Because a lot of times they're not going to share that with you. So we start disrupting the cycle, the pattern. If I don't like the story that I'm living, then number one, what action can I take right away? So let's flip over to the other side, kind of the other. Let's go to, I call it about 3:00 on the on the story framework. If you think about it like a circle, like a pattern. So let's go look at what are the thoughts, right? So here's what I did when I turned 30 and I wasn't happy with what I was experiencing. Okay. When I wasn't happy with what I was experiencing, the one thing that I knew I could do, the action I could take, was to get up early in the morning and start taking in positive content. So I'd literally go on YouTube. I would watch positive motivational speakers for like an hour while I drank my coffee between 5 a.m. and 6 a.m. That was the action that I took. Magically, over time, what started to happen is we started to experience, I noticed that there was opportunity where there wasn't opportunity before. I started to notice more positivity in others. I started to notice things that I didn't see before, that I was blaming the economy or blaming other people about not being there, and suddenly they sort of showed up. And really what that was, it was a result of so much reprogramming that was actually going on in my brain. And so over time, I now take in more than an hour a day of content on YouTube. I literally have it just playing in the background almost constantly, or podcasts or audiobooks or reading books or coaching calls and study groups and the different things that, that I've programmed into my life. And it's literally altered thought. Like, in a lot of ways, I don't even recognize the guy who existed 7 years ago, because I've done so much of the thought reprogramming. And that there's a whole rule of 95%. I can easily fall back into my old habits, my old patterns, like tomorrow, if I were to stop doing these things. But I really like what I have now. I really like the results that it got me, so I continue to do more. So those are the two ways that we can take a play on the story framework and say, okay, so I have this story in my life and I don't like it a lot, right? Maybe I hate it. Maybe it's just something that I want to tweak. Doesn't matter. Okay, so what is the story? Number one, take a different action. Just do something differently. Even if you don't know if it's the right one or not, don't overanalyze it. Try something. Okay, you can research and try stuff if you really want to go all in. There's a lot of different things that you can do. And then the next thing, the next piece is to continuously, on a daily basis, do what you can to take in something positive, to put good things into your brain. And we basically say this, good shit in, good shit out. Right? If I put good content in my mind, I'm going to produce more good stuff. It's just the way it is. If I put positive content, I'm going to have more positive thoughts. If you're going to bed every night, falling asleep, watching Walking Dead, season 5, or for me at the time, back when I was 30, it was Sons of Anarchy, which by the way is still an epic show. And I did watch all 7 seasons of Sons of Anarchy. But I took them in much slower once I started producing positive thought, and I didn't go to sleep with that as the last thing going to my brain. But here's what happens when you have violence and gore and negativity going into your brain right before you go to sleep. Guess what? You wake up in a different mood. You wake up in a different energy, and you start looking for things like that to occur in your life. So that's how we take the angle on using the story framework to literally start changing your story.
Yeah, absolutely. I had a really good example of this in a coaching group recently where I had one client who it was a professional situation where like really running into some burnout issues, like working all hours of the night, starting back up first thing in the morning, trying to continue to work with customers who just weren't returning on her time or treating her super well. And so it was just like constant stress, constant tired. And we kind of looked at it from this framework and said, okay, what do we need to do to change this, to fix this? Because we can recognize that it's not working, but like the what to do was kind of a struggle point. And so one thing I think is really important is to remember that it's going to take multiple angles. So it is going to take just the tactical, tangible, boots on the ground action and the mindset digging into what's going on. So on one hand, from a tactical, tangible standpoint, we started saying, you know what? You're back in the office by 3:00, 2 days a week. And after 5:00 on Friday, no work. Don't want to hear from, your boss doesn't want to hear from you until, 8:00 Monday morning. Right. We had to really super tangible boundaries to create the behavior change in the short term. But to your point, right, if we're not careful, we can rubber band back, right? We start to say, oh, yes, I know I'm supposed to be back in the office by 3 today, but I have this. So I'm gonna run late just tonight, right? Just tonight. It'll be okay. And then we start to rubber band back into our old patterns and habits. And so that's where we started digging into the mindset thing. So on one hand, it's taking in more positive content, surrounding yourself with positive people, maybe letting go of some negative people who are not bringing any value to your life, but also digging into kind of the whys of what's driving that behavior in the first part. So, what are you afraid of happening if you don't just work? Or, who are you afraid of having judge you for not getting the sale or not getting what? So on one hand, yes, we can set the boundaries of, I need to stop working after set number of time, or I need to be back in the office. But if I don't tackle, the fear of judgment, the fear of, letting people down, the fear of failure, those boundaries in the long term will disappear. And so making sure that when you're changing your story, you're coming at it from both sides of, yes, the tangible tactical action in the short term is super, super important, because for a lot of us, in this situation, right, we couldn't even tackle the mindset until we stopped the bad behavior of working just hours on end. Like we had to tackle the short-term problem in order to even get to the deeper stuff. But to me, it was just such a perfect example of this has to come from a bunch of different angles in order to solve and change the problem.
Absolutely. And we could probably do a whole other podcast on like what's going on in the psyche and how to get to the root of what's really going on. I know we're going to do, the next episode is on shame, right? All right. So teaser, you're going to want to tune in to dive into more of what Amanda was just mentioning, because a lot of our actions that we're taking are really just to avoid shame in life. And so, or not taking for that matter. And so we're going to dive deep into that whole realm, because that's what we've noticed in working with hundreds of coaching clients over the last several years is, that's literally one of the biggest inhibitors is those deep neural pathways that are kind of, where you're trying to avoid embarrassment, you're trying to avoid shame. And there's a whole story around that, but very often they're just really, really hard to see. So we'll dive more into that, but there's your teaser alert. Jump onto the next episode or when that one comes out. So Amanda, one other thing I wanted to talk about as it pertains to using this particular framework and using this type of work on yourself. It's one thing to say, I don't like my story. I'm going to take a different action. I'm going to try to reprogram thought. That's great. Be prepared for the action to fail. Okay. So this is just, kind of a heads up. So a lot of times like, oh, Mark and Amanda talked about this framework. I'm going to change my story. And so, I don't like the way that my body feels right now. And so tonight I'm going to go home before I, have dinner. I'm going to get that run in. Right. Well, guess what? Like if you haven't done that in a while, it's going to friggin' hurt. Okay. Like, and you might do that for 15 or 50 days, before you start to see the results. Right. And so, part of this is like, well, what story do you want to be telling? Like, why are you running, 50 days in a row as an example? So what are you creating? But just be prepared for like, sometimes it's not going to work. Sometimes it's going to hurt. Sometimes it might be scary. Sometimes it might be hard. Sometimes it might be painful. And, just know, like, if you're on the verge, if it looks a little bit scary, you're probably heading in the right direction. Okay. If it looks like it's something that, you want to put off because you're not sure how that conversation is going to go down, you're probably going the right direction. It just, that's one of those telltale signs. If it's easy, then it's easy for a reason. And you're likely to just end up back where you are. So, but here's the thing, I just was talking with one of our coaching clients, one of our executive coaching clients this morning about this whole concept. And this guy, and I've done a couple of Snapchat rants about this already. I went on Instagram and talked about this. So I'm going to talk about it here because it pertains perfectly. This guy has done the work. He's used this framework to be living in a story that he loves. And his business is moving in the right direction. His relationship with his kids is moving in the right direction. His health, like he's running every night, like, for 45 minutes, like he's getting the distance in, his stamina is up, his energy is great all day long. And so I was like, hey, great, Denny, good job. Like here's the thing, right? Anything that is thriving today eventually becomes standard, right? That eventually becomes normal. And what a good deal, right? And this is how, one of the things I put in the description for our Facebook Live was that this is maybe how it even gets easier over time. Here's what I mean by that is now, once you get to that level where you're thriving, you've leveled up. Now, when you're thriving, when you're in momentum, okay, that's kind of what we describe as thriving. That's the feeling of thriving, is when you feel like you're in momentum. What you start to experience is like that can actually become normal. It's a very human thing that we do. Like what's great now, like, whatever. It used to be cool when you had America Online in 1998 and you could dial up to the internet. Like that was super badass and amazing, right? I wouldn't, unless it was like in a museum, I'm not going to go do that on purpose now, right? Like that was cool, right? But now it's like I'm sitting here like I was frustrated in the middle of the podcast because you cut out for a second. I didn't know if you were asking me a question or whatever because the Wi-Fi literally went out. It went, my computer even told me your internet connection is unstable. And so this big old house that we live in, sometimes the Wi-Fi doesn't flow super easy through the walls, and I've been working on that. But, so all of a sudden, like my expectation is I can go almost anywhere. I can crack open my laptop or I can go on my phone and I have internet. Right? No dial tone, no slow connection, no like super slow download speeds. I'm having the unstable connection right as I say this right now. So but here's what we do, as people, like when we get to that level where we're thriving, what we get to do is we get to start to look at and be strategic about, or just be forward thinking about what could be next. Like, how can I push myself just a little bit, like 1%? Doesn't have to be dramatic change, but just like what would 1% or 10% better or more look like for me? Okay. And that's what we call in our model, in our work, we call that transcending to the next level. What that basically means is that you're opting back into the work, right? And so if you can run a mile, now the goal becomes to run 2 miles. And that is like, does it actually suck more now that you get to mile, marker 1.3, 1.4? Yes. It will be a struggle until you do it, a few days in a row, or, 3 or 4 times a week for a couple of weeks. Now all of a sudden you can run 2 miles, right? And so what was, that 1 mile thing now doesn't seem so special, right? So this is what we do, is we create different levels. And so the only way to continue staying in momentum is to continue opting into that next level. And so we could dive into lots more on that, but I just want to, help people be, apprised of that. So once you start changing your story and going to work on your story, the way that you continue to have an increasingly better story is to, continue to to transcend, what we call transcend. Here's just one little caveat. I mean, this is what we do as humans. Like, I wish that you could, I wish that I could say you could get to the level where you're thriving, and that would be awesome, and there was no more things. I wish I could say it's just always going to feel that way. But the human body and the human mind are not built to operate that way. Part of the human experience in being here is getting to experience the cycles of life. So what we encourage people to do is to take control, radical self-accountability, and actually be in control of what story you want to be continuing to tell, and actually be purposeful about it instead of reacting to what you don't want. So there you go, Amanda. That's what I've got on radical self-accountability today.
Awesome. I wanted to add just one more thought on this, because so early on we talked about like the 95% account or hardwiring, right? And so, all of that's kind of your childhood laying the groundwork for how your preferences, behaviors, opinions, how they've all been formed. I think one thing if people aren't careful about is that they can fall into using that as an excuse, right? I had a hard childhood, so this is just who I am. Or, came from a divorced parents, right? Like, that's just who I am. Or I've never seen a relationship work. That's just who I am, right? Or, you always cut the other guy in traffic back off because that's just what you're supposed to do, right? Like, and so it can become an excuse. And what I would encourage people is to be careful about using it as an excuse when really it's an explanation to help you make change.
That's really
right?
good.
So sometimes I do not take credit for this. This comes, I've heard this. If anybody is a big podcaster, Dak Shepard's new podcast, Armchair Expert, is very good. And this is, he's actually a recovering addict. And so this is something he talks about a lot from the recovery process, is being careful of using things as excuses when they really should be leveraged as an explanation. Because if we're not willing to do the hard work to understand where we come from, it can be very hard to make change moving forward, right? So if I don't know, why do I have such a big deal with perfectionism? Why am I so afraid of failure? Why, where does that shame mentality come from? If I don't try to understand why that is happening, it's very hard for me to make adjustments moving forward. But being careful of saying something because something was that way, that it always has to be that way. I just finished reading Girl Wash Your Face by Rachel Hollis, which is a really super good book. And one of the things she says is that if we can identify the core of our struggles while simultaneously understanding that we're truly in control of conquering them, then that's where we can utterly change our trajectory, right? So we have to know where we came from in order to change the path moving forward. And I think that it's actually a really empowering thought when it comes to this story framework and self-accountability. Like, to your point earlier, when you first learned that Jack Canfield, 100% responsibility, it's like, well, crap, no, that's no fun to be 100% responsibility or 100% responsible. But I almost think it's almost freeing to say, wow, if the only person responsible for my success is me, then I get to go forth and conquer versus waiting for someone else to give me permission to do so, which is what so many of us do, is wait for someone else to say, yeah, it's okay for you to do that, or it's okay for you to do that differently. So just some thoughts that I've really kind of, as I've heard them in other podcasts and other books, I think they just really layer on nicely to this idea.
Right. I mean, and that's, just to give a couple examples to highlight exactly what you just said, right? So, if my past were my limiting factor, right? If what was true in the past and what I grew up with, if that had to be what I pretty much produce down the road, then, my wife, who grew up with a, kind of a tough relationship, situation growing up, mom wasn't super present, parents were divorced, grew up in a trailer park, and that's the light stuff. If that were true, right, then she, should have ended up living a similar life and not being, a full-time professor at an elite university, right, and having a PhD by 32 years old. That shouldn't happen if my past is determining. I mean, the past can be massive fuel for going forward, or it can be a massive anchor for keeping you stuck. Like you get to determine which one it's going to be. The difference is making a choice, right? I just think about like where I'm at in the fitness thing right now. I mean, 4 years ago, 4 years ago was the first time I hired a trainer to help me get better at doing, fitness and nutrition. And, my situation at that point was, 178 pounds, 23% body fat. And, today it's, a couple 100 pounds and, 11 or 12% body fat, and I can do things. And I'm training, I'm training for Muay Thai and, going to fight in a tournament and just do different things. Like there was, my history was not that. I mean, I always been into sports and always been athletic, but that was like, because I was this way or because nobody in my family's ever done this doesn't mean that I can't create the story. So this is literally what we're talking about. The whole point of this: radical self-accountability, choosing into the story that you want to be living, and not letting anybody else be the dictator over what that gets to be for you. And we see this time and time again in the corporate workspace. People who are stuck in a story that, well, because my boss is this way or always has been that way, I can't have a different story with him or her. Because they treated me this way, or because my company always does this, like I can't live a better story inside this place. And so what do? I go looking for a better story in a different book, which means I go to a different company, right? And then guess what? Inevitably, and this is almost 100%, almost always what happens, unless somebody makes a major life change in between leaving one company to go to the next in order to improve their situation, they almost always end up back in the same situation within 18 months. It's consistent. And we have seen people that have been part of our program, whatever, they leave the company that they're at because they just can't wait for life to get better. They go to that next, I know a situation very well with one of our clients where, this one guy left to go to another company and, because the grass is going to be greener on the other side, running from the problems, moving into another story without fully addressing why that story was the way it was, and has now been fired from that other job because they just kept recreating the same stuff because they're stuck in the story. They're waiting for somebody else to make it better for them. And that is the complete opposite of what we call radical self-accountability and owning your stuff 100%. So good thoughts, Amanda. I love it. All good stuff. All good things.
Excellent. Any other thoughts on this topic that you want to layer
I
in
really
here?
don't. I think this is good. And I know that, those of you listening to the podcast, whether it's, you're live with us on Facebook right now, or you are somewhere in the world driving on your way to work and listening to this, here's the thing, guys, like just own your shit. If you don't like the story, go to work on the story. If you don't know how to do that, we have a Thriving Leader event coming up on July 25th and 26th that you need to be at. So come join us in Omaha, and we can help you dive into some of the story stuff and see how we can help you, or how you can help you go to work on your story even a little bit better. So that's coming up. We're to the point now where we can start talking about September events. I know we have, I think we've got an Army, right, in September. Do we? No.
You can't spring this on me without having my calendar.
There are events, and you can call it anything. There are more of them coming up in the fall. The next big one is going to be in July, guys, here in Omaha, July 25th and 26th. So get your people over to that thing. The events keep getting bigger and bigger. We just had 30 people at the live event last week. We know that we can handle more, so we'll take the limit off, and we'll if we need to get a bigger room, we'll get a bigger room to get all of you guys in there. So please come hang out at the Thriving Leader events. For other information, more podcast episodes, to see the other 64 episodes or whatever we're at now, to get the blog posts, all of our book recommendations. We've got a lot of cool resources and downloads and manager guides and leader guides and sales guides and different things over at markjewelltraining.com. So jump over there and take a gander, take a look around, markjewelltraining.com. We've got that. And get excited, you guys, because pretty soon you're going to be able to download the Thrive Today app onto your phone. So stay tuned for more information on that. But I wrote the contract yesterday. We are on our way to building the Thrive Today app, and it's going to be next level. So get jacked about that. I say everything else is just surviving, my friends. It's your time to thrive today. So let's go get it.
Thanks again for tuning into this week's episode. If you like what you heard, make sure to jump over to Apple Podcasts and leave us a rating and review. We appreciate the feedback, and it helps other people find the show. As always, if you're looking for more resources to go from surviving to thriving, check out our website at www.markjewelltraining.com. That's Jewell with 2 L's. And you can find us under Mark Jewell Speaking and Training on all the major social networks. Remember, survival is dead. It's your time to thrive today. See you next week.